Welcome, everybody, to another XSCALE Alliance podcast. Today, we will be talking with Peter Merrill about A Game Without Thrones. Peter, how do tribes organize today? Copy Spotify?
Well, there's nothing wrong with what Spotify is doing. It just forgets several hundred years of First Nations history and lessons learned by people who did this with groups of up to 1 million for life and death reasons. Just possibly, there are some things that we've forgotten.
What's always puzzling me about the Spotify debate is that there are still people out who believe you can copy Spotify. I mean, completely tearing it out of the context. I always try to explain to people that, okay, see, Spotify is a very unique thing. So they knew when they started, they either will be very successful or they will be out of business. So they had a completely different background as far as building an organizational culture is concerned than, for example, an existing legacy organization.
Well, I think I'm in two minds about it. I completely agree with you that just taking the practices of chapter meetings and guilds out of context and thinking that that's going to solve all your problems is a little bit silly. At a minimum, we're going to need some of the leadership as a service protocol that we discussed a few podcasts ago. But I don't think that Spotify itself can be held up as an ideal tribal form. And what's funny about this stuff is that the more you look into it, the more you begin to think, maybe it is possible for us to do things like this. But to do it, we're going to have to change the way that we change. We're going to have to demonstrate that we can get this working in the small and then grow it. And when we were talking about the 7 Samurai Kanban also a few podcasts ago, I think we gave a method whereby, yes, you can use this and expect to get an outcome that's great. Whether it's a great outcome, it looks like Spotify's great outcome, well, that's a very different question. How would you even gauge that you're doing something that has the same kind of success as a Spotify? It's easy to point at things that are not working, but if something is working, is it working the same way? It's a little bit like when Nyberg decided to take SAFe into Lego, Lego the corporation, not Lego the blocks, though. I guess Lego the corporation that makes the blocks. He gave this beautiful talk, Is SAFe Evil? And after having described what they'd done, he summed up by saying, so I think that what we wound up with at the end of all of that was not evil, but I don't know if it was safe.
So true. So how do real tribes work?
Well, I feel some trepidation at this point in time because I am an Australian. I'm sitting here in the youngest of nations, or just about the youngest of nations. Now, at the same time, we have very strong First Nations culture in Australia. When I say youngest of nations, I'm talking about the country, not the tradition, not the long society that's been here for 60,000 years at least. We have things in Australian First Nations traditions that have been completely forgotten, that have been thrown out the door. And here I am proposing to talk about mainly a North American First Nations society, ignoring the Australian Aboriginal tradition. I feel like I'm doing several different forms of cultural misappropriation at once. So at the same time, there is a healthy tradition of this kind of misappropriation we're going to look at, and it's generated some very successful, some very powerful institutions, including things like democracy and socialism and feminism, and really most of the social innovations we've had since the settling of the Americas can be traced back one way or another to a group of people called the Europeans called them the Iroquois. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee. And for English speakers, and I am an English speaker, I found two different translations, and I'm so ignorant, I don't even know which one is best. Most people quote Haudenosaunee as meaning the people of the Longhouse, but apparently some also translate it as the people who build. And to me, to people who build, that kind of means the engineers. And since you and I are engineers, maybe it's not so much misappropriation as that. I don't know. But I guess all we can really do is apologize to all the First Nations people, and especially the Haudenosaunee, in advance for the terrible mistakes, blunders, and glosses I'm about to make in trying to understand what their tribes were all about. The reason I am willing to undertake such a dangerous and well, basically poorly considered course is there's a huge amount of value for us in the Agile culture by understanding how these things really work and digging into the experiences, both positive and negative, of real tribal societies, so that we can try and bring value to our clients, which at the end of the day, that's sort of the point. And if we can bring the kind of value that turns those clients into really progressive learning organizations or learning ecosystems, to use the last two letters of XSCALE, then hopefully all of the shame that I'm presently wearing will be worth it. At least that's how I'm going to try and proceed. Are you willing to come with me on this this journey into foolishness, Stefan?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm all fired up and curious to learn more. So we
Okay.
start at Spotify, I assume.
Well, let's at least have a glance at it. I think most of the people who are listening to this will have some familiarity. We have tribes. Each tribe is made of squads. The squads, for some reason, have product owners. That's a bit weird. I don't know why you'd need to do that. The product owners form a little meta chapter in there, or meta squad, and there are chapters that cut across the squads. The chapter meetings are basically for people of common competence to share their learnings, their problems, their opportunities, to look at how they can enable each other. So it's kind of like a much higher bandwidth alternative to a scrum of scrums. And then we have many different guild structures that can cut across the tribes. There is immediately a little bit of weirdness in this picture, though, because according to the really beautiful Spotify videos from 2012, a tribe can scale up to 100 people before it hits what they thought of as the Dunbar number. Robin Dunbar is not some sainted anthropologist from the 19th century. He's no older than you and I, and he's still around. And he was asked about this Dunbar number thing, which he didn't call the Dunbar number. He doesn't know who did. And he thought that this idea of 150 is the maximum and then 100 as being safe, he thought that, or he said that was really only relevant to subsistence level villages. That if we're working in a modern corporate context where there are many overlapping, hopefully networks of trust, but at least networks of acquaintance, that a number more like 60 to 80 might be more in tune. When we look at this diagram, we see tribes of about 30. So it looks really, really neat. Those chapters of just 4 people, it looks very workable. Imagine there was 100. We might have chapters, let's say we have 2 developers per squad, and we had a chapter that included all of those. That's getting up to 20 or more people in a chapter. That's not going to work very well. Really, we don't see good self-organization when we have groups of more than 6 meeting. And we've got some data on that. We'll talk about another time. But so there's something in between the idea that most people have taken from this, where you've got these great big 100-person tribes and these little squads. There's something in between that we need. And in XSCALE, we call it a value stream. In SAFE, I think they call it a program, though they don't put hard number limits on it. So I guess in SAFE, it could be just about anything. Well, maybe I'm being a bit rude. I'm sure there's some guidance in SAFE, and I don't mean to bang on SAFE. We did that already. But I do want to take a deeper look at things that that aren't Spotify, and things that we there's so much documentation on the Haudenosaunee tradition. And part of the reason for that is the Haudenosaunee are still very much around and doing important things, but they have troubles they didn't have back in the day. When they were at their height, there were perhaps 1 million people, but these days, well, due to a series of unfortunate historical events, the Haudenosaunee is saddled with an American government and a Canadian government, and they are still determined to have both of those governments honor their treaties with the Haudenosaunee to enable the people to govern themselves. And so they still have their traditional form of governance. And we're going to look at some things that are irrelevant when it comes to the American-Canadian Iroquois governments, and probably do terrible injustice to the original. But on the other hand, the Haudenosaunee interoperated with the Europeans before the American War of Independence for about 200 years, very successfully. They were a very strong political power right up until the War of Independence. And at that point, well, things went south. So here we're looking at a picture of a Mohawk village before, when I say things went south, I guess it's an Australian expression. Things started to get very difficult. This village doesn't look very much like the way that we think about American Indians. There's no teepees. These people have a permanent settlement, and the settlement is surrounded by agricultural developments. They're not just fields. A lot of the relationship with natural creatures was a form of husbandry as well. We have this weird impression that that these massive herds of buffalo that ranged all over America were running wild. But in point of fact, if you look at the way that grass grows, it doesn't take very much to realize that you get much better throughput when you're trying to farm cattle if you can tear down the fences and allow them to move across the prairies. You can have vast fields of grass and huge buffalo herds that can support many more people than the way we do our industrial agriculture. At least, who knows, maybe with the industrial stuff, all of the pesticides and herbicides and antibiotics make up for that. But whether it makes up for it sustainably is a good question. Anyway, I want to get to this diagram we're looking at, because I'm pretty certain I could rabbit on about all kinds of things outside of the walls of this village for a very long time. But within the walls, we have these curious structures. They're called longhouses. At least that's the European name for them. And I freely confess I do not have more words in Haudenosaunee tongue than place names, and I'm pretty certain I would mispronounce those. Nevertheless, I'm going to carry on using the names that I've got from books about them that were mainly written by Europeans. Well, I think I've done enough disclaiming about that. These longhouses, each of them has a row of chimneys on the top and a row of 5 fires down the middle. On either side of each fire, there's a family not that different to the families that we know. They have a little apartment on each side of the fire, which is to say there's 10 families in each longhouse. Now, the women of the family form a clan, and the clans get to make decisions for themselves. If you're in a longhouse, no one can tell you how to run your longhouse. You have agreements, traditional agreements, I'm going to call them treaties, between the people who are in the clan, but the clan level ways of going about things are so well established that they don't need an awful lot of consideration. However, between the longhouses, well, there are concerns that everybody in the village has to deal with. It may be, for example, that one or another family, the land was shared, nevertheless, different families would have different plots and different longhouses would have different plots and so on. It may be that one or another family or longhouse isn't holding up its end, it isn't performing its responsibilities. That would be a source of trouble. You'd have to deal with that. It may be that there's disagreement about how to plan and lay out the village. If we have disagreements like that, we have to have some way of resolving them. And if we were Europeans, we would think, oh, well, what we'll do is we'll have a centralized legislature, and we will resolve these issues by putting laws in place, regulations, and those will live forever. That's not the way the Haudenosaunee did things. They had a way of, for each clan, which is to say the females, one thing I have to explain immediately. The Haudenosaunee society was remarkably fair in its distribution of responsibilities between the genders. So much so that when Stanton and Gage started casting around for inspirations for feminism, their experience of the Haudenosaunee, it was a proof that their aspirations were actually possible, that could be realized, because European society didn't work like that. Anyway, so these clans led by the eldest female in their family. The matriarch of the clan is called the clan mother, and the clan mother selects a representative, a male representative, to attend a council. So the clan mother has the ability to remove the horns from the head of this representative. The representatives, the Europeans like to call them chiefs. The Haudenosaunee words are more like voices or speakers. So each clan has a speaker. The speakers get together, and the number of clans varied from one Iroquois nation to another, from 3 to 9. I think, if I recall correctly, the Mohawk used 9. So these speakers would get together to propose treaties that their clans had already agreed on. So the clans made their arrangements for what treaties they'd like to propose by consensus. There was no majority rule. The way that Europeans do things with voting has nothing to do with the way that the Iroquois do, or did. So then in the council of these, they called them, well, sachems is the word that is the Haudenosaunee word, but if we think of them as peace chiefs or peace speakers, they were there to try and sort things out without resort to violence, because the alternative was, well, what you would expect. And the governing treaty under which all of this worked is called the Great Treaty of Peace. So these councils would get together and they could sort out, all right, here's what we're going to do about the problems with the allocation of fields in the village. But we're talking about a large society, not just one village. So the clan structure cut across larger social units. So that for every village, there is a council that sorts things out for the clans in the village. And I'm going to say for the longhouses in the village, because longhouse is the metaphor for all of the decision-making elements in their society. So if we look at that village as being one village on a river, a longhouse with its row of fires down the middle mirrors the structure of the villages along a river. The villages along a river, this is really where we have this idea of tribe. So if we think of the river as very similar to the row of fires, then there's a very similar structure to the collection of villages on either side, to the collection of families on either side in a longhouse. And so there was a council for the villages on the river. And it was not a council of representatives of villages. It was a council of representatives of clans, because the clans cut across the villages as well. And the way this worked is really neat, because people who were descended, well, I should say not descended, the children, the immediate children of any of the women in a clan were held to be members of the clan. But if they were male, they had to marry outside of their clan. They had to marry people in a different clan. So the Haudenosaunee, because of that fundamental principle, they regarded everybody in the same clan as brothers and sisters, and everybody outside of that clan. And we're talking about this at all the levels up to the confederacy of all of the Iroquois nations. The people outside of that clan were regarded as cousins, because most of the time they were descended from people who had been in your clan, but who had left to marry outside of the clan. So this creates a very dense social weave. It reinforces trust relationships, and most of the resulting economy was based on treaties. Treaties are not permanent laws. Treaties are arrangements between social units at the same level. So a treaty between families within a longhouse, a treaty between longhouses in a village, a treaty between villages within the same tribe, which is to say on a river, those treaties were made by consensus. If two villages would not agree on a particular treaty, then that treaty didn't bind them. And in general, as many villages as they wanted could sign up to a treaty, but if some wanted to be left out, they could be, unless there was a conflict. And if the treaty was to resolve a conflict, well, in addition to having peace voices, the clan mothers also picked war voices, who were typically younger fellows who could perform many of the functions that the elder statesmen could not, including making various forms of war. But we'll come to that in a little bit. So we have the tribe along the river is basically a longhouse of villages, which is to say a longhouse of longhouses of longhouses. So this is a fractal structured society. Does this make sense so far, Stefan?
Absolutely. I find this fractality approach interesting, because it also reflects the idea how nature works and how nature scales. I don't know whether you have read the recent book. Let me fetch it. From Mr. Geoffrey West, Scale. I can highly recommend this, because it's also addressing the underlying nature of scaling to organizations and not just organisms. So there's an interesting overlap that should be explored, I believe.
Interesting. Well, maybe we can make that the subject of a future XSCALE podcast.
And that would be a good idea. Sounds good.
Cool. All right. It would be nice to do one where it's not me gassing on and asking questions. You can do it. That would be nice. I'd like that. Okay.
It's gone. It's a good job that you're doing, so come on.
Yeah. Oh, all right. I'll stop whinging. So getting back to this, what's really important to understand here is that at all levels, the councils are made up of representatives of clans, not of the individual social units. So in a tribe, they are not representing villages. Within a village, they are not representing the longhouses. They're representing the clans, which can cut across the longhouses. In principle, I think you would usually have some affinity between one clan and one longhouse, but given the cousin system, even there, it doesn't work the same way. Within a longhouse, the councils, again, are representing, there are some subdivisions of the clan system. I don't want to go into too much detail because I'll probably get it wrong. But the key anyway is that the people who are bringing proposals to a council have already worked them out together to the satisfaction of their clan at the next level down. So it means that it's much easier to get to an agreement. So that's one river in the Mohawk Nation. And there are other rivers, which is to say there are other tribes. And those tribes together have a council for the Mohawk Nation. These councils meet to a synchronized schedule of usually harvest festivals, but there are various other forms of social events. The Iroquois also influenced some of the American forms of dance. A lot of the early square dance masters started out in Indian nations. So the cycle of movements in the dance and the cycle of movements in the harvest festival, these are very closely related in the Iroquois culture and the Indian cultures in general. The beautiful thing about this is that the treaties were not held to be laws that took effect forever and affected everybody. They were agreements that people signed up for until the next harvest festival, at which point they would have to be refreshed. So the idea was a chain of treaties that would bind together the villages on a river and would bind together the tribes within a nation. And these are separate concerns. So if you are trying to deal with the concerns of a village, you're worried about the fields and the water and the way that things are laid out in the village and the people's differences and disputes in the village. But if you're having a council along a river, you're concerned with the watercourse and you're concerned with mutual defense against hostile tribes, because in this culture, it was thought that if you hadn't negotiated a treaty, then at least in principle, you were at war. That didn't mean that you're going to go and slaughter everybody, although if we start to look at the early history of the Iroquois, that's indeed what it meant. But it does mean that these concerns don't overlap. You've got one concern that's about the organization of the villages and another concern that's about the organization of the people within a village. You don't need to have a power to overrule. There's no particular reason to centralize. And that's really the beauty of this system. So when we understand that the Haudenosaunee were a confederacy of 5 nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, the Mohawk, then we begin to see that this is an organization that covered a lot of territory, and it was far and away the most successful confederacy of its kind. Where this great law of peace came from, there's some dispute about when, but where. It came from 2 people, one who came to the Haudenosaunee from outside, from a nation called the Huron, and one from inside. The guy from inside is known as Hiawatha. I don't know if you ever heard of the Longfellow poem, The Song of Hiawatha, Stefan.
No, never.
Ah, okay. When I was in school anyway, it was a popular English language poem. And unfortunately, it has absolutely nothing to do with the historical Hiawatha, so maybe it's not so bad you haven't heard it. Longfellow just liked the scansion of the name, so he took stories about a completely different Indian character and used the phrase, the name Hiawatha, because it made his poetry come out all right. Anyway, this gentleman lived most likely in the 13th or 14th century. there are a couple of eclipses that have people used to try and date the period. And Hiawatha, he lived at a time where there was no great law of peace, and in fact, there was a long and violent period of civil war between the Iroquois tribes. So in that war, his 3 daughters were killed, and he became a hermit, a recluse. But he still needed to come and trade on occasion, and in trading, he was introduced one way or another. There are so many stories about it that no one's entirely certain, to a gentleman who's usually referred to out of respect as the peacemaker. Has nothing to do with the weapon of the same name that happened in later centuries. So the peacemaker, and I've just learned that out of respect, one shouldn't actually use his Haudenosaunee name, and since I don't really need to, I won't. He had some very strange ideas about how you could resolve these wars, but he also had a stammer. Hiawatha was very well regarded politically, was very well positioned, and he was able to represent the ideas directly to the Haudenosaunee. That's not to say that they liked them. In particular, the Onondaga, who you see here in the middle under the white tree of peace. I'll explain what these beads mean in just a little while. They were led by a gentleman named Tadodaho, and gentleman's the wrong word. Apparently he was a cannibal, and he was abusive to the people in his own village, his own tribe, much less the others around him. But there was a state of constant war and violence going on. So Hiawatha and the peacemaker approached him, saying, well, why don't we do things this way? And apparently he didn't think that was a very good idea. So they managed to get out with their lives. The good thing about it was they also forged a conversation with a lady named Jigonsase. And so she and the peacemaker and Hiawatha together started to approach the other tribes to say, look, here's a way that we could resolve our disputes without killing each other, and then having this cycle of revenge. And over a period of 20 years, they eventually got all of the other 4 nations to agree that this was a good way of doing things. So they went back to Tadodaho and suggested that he ought to do those things with them. And he was violently opposed, but, well, there were 4 nations to 1. And so he was looking at decimation, and Jigonsase took him aside, and according to the legend, she combed the snakes out of his hair. So he came back and said, look, I'll tell you what, I am willing to form this peaceful confederacy with you people, as long as I am the president, as long as I get veto power. And they said, oh, that's a good idea. We can do that. He said, well, then I'm in. And they said, oh, but there's one more thing. He said, what's that? And they said, well, every one of our nations is going to have a peace chief who also has veto power. So nevertheless, Tadodaho was the first among equals. And even today, there is the role called Tadodaho at the Grand Council of all of the nations that works that way. And remember again that it's the clans that cut across the nations that are being represented, not the nations themselves. So to try and emphasize this, this is, well, both of these things we're looking at, these are what's called wampum, which is to say belts of beads. Beads are made from shellfish. They come in purple and white colors. And this circle wampum is also known as the 50 families. Basically, every bead, there are different stories about this too. I've read that every bead is the name of one of the original 50 chiefs that took part in the first confederacy. But as far as I can tell, each of the rows of beads represents a tribe, and which would make sense that you would have at least one representative for each of those. And so this is a picture of the Haudenosaunee people as a whole. if each village is, say, 10 longhouses on average, and each longhouse is about 50 people, then we're looking at around about 1 million people. So the beauty of their society is the dense network of family relationships that support their decision-making protocol, which is all about consensus decisions. Because of the fact that everybody in the Confederacy could regard each other as brothers and sisters and cousins, it made it into a place where people could band together for their mutual benefit more easily than the tribes who are not confederated this way outside of their borders. Does that make sense so far, Stefan?
Absolutely. Very interesting.
Okay. So this is a pretty picture, but I want to look at it at a more intimate level. So we already have this idea that we have chains of treaties, and you can see the structures, both the villages within a tribe and the tribes within a nation and the nations within the Confederacy as a whole. But if we go back down and look at this at a more intimate level, then we can understand what's going on properly. Now, this is a modern image of, it represents the Haudenosaunee System. So the ladies on the left, they are one clan, and you can see there's a clan mother. So the clan mother has selected one of the male peace speakers who are sitting down around the fire trying to make their decisions. You can see that behind them, there are some gentlemen wearing very fancy headdresses, and these headdresses are associated with the clans and actually with the nations too. So if they are speakers from the next social level up, they have no power to overrule. They are there to inform the decisions being made at the council meeting. And what's more, the council meeting has no ability to overrule its clans. Each of the speakers has to represent the concerns, the ideas of the clan. And if they don't, then the clan mother will remove them. Now, how can this charming but somewhat feeble old lady do that? Well, you see that there are 4 very strong, muscly looking fellows at the back of the room. They are the war speakers, and the clan mother selects them as well. And they're basically there to enforce protocol. That's their entire responsibility. So there's a system of checks and balances in this that works very nicely, and worked very nicely for a very long time. And we could think of the war speakers or the war chiefs as being equivalent to scrum masters. And we could think of the peace speakers as equivalent to product owners, but we would be ignoring the richness of interconnection between all of them. There's a lot more we could say about the symbolism in this picture, but I want to move on a little bit. The British, which is to say the Americans at the time, made a treaty with the Iroquois. It's called the two-row wampum. You see that there's 2 rows in the wampum, and they're supposed to represent 2 canoes going along side by side, the 2 societies, the European culture and the Iroquois culture. And their idea in this wampum is that there's no interference between the 2. That if someone lives the Iroquois way, if they've been accepted by the Haudenosaunee tribes or nations, then Haudenosaunee treaties apply to them. They don't apply to people who don't buy in, who are not accepted in that way. And likewise, the Haudenosaunee are not affected by the American culture. The American laws don't apply to them, except where other treaties are arranged. So the intent is that if you make an explicit agreement and everybody buys in, fantastic. But in principle, there is no contact between the people in each canoe. Well, that's the way the Haudenosaunee thought of it. But the Europeans had other ideas. This is the Franklin penny, the very first unit of currency in the United States. And Benjamin Franklin wrote a book about Haudenosaunee treaties. And he was very influenced in his ideas, and actually so was Jefferson. Most of the founding fathers were familiar. And so this idea of a set of 13 states that were joined together like the links of a chain, well, this is the same metaphor that the Haudenosaunee use for refreshing their treaties. They call it brightening the chain. So every one of those harvest festivals, they get together, they look at, well, how do we need to vary these treaties? Which of them are no longer valid? Which of them need to be modified? Maybe we need some new ones. And that was the main business of the councils. So as far as Franklin was concerned, that made sense. And the original United States, the Confederacy, as it was, of 13 states, that lasted for about a dozen years after the War of Independence, or after the Peace of Paris that ended the War of Independence. And at the end of a dozen years, it became clear that their social structures, the European social structures, were breaking down. And the main reason for this had nothing to do with the Haudenosaunee. It had to do with the fact that they were trying to mix Haudenosaunee ideas, holus bolus, with European ideas about majority rule and centralized systems of laws. And these are two different paradigms. If you try to combine them, you don't get dolphins, you get half a cow, half a fish. So that didn't stop people from trying. Rousseau was very influenced in his book, The Republic, and others, by the Iroquois ideas. So much so that he identified, for example, that the sovereign of a country is not the king. The sovereign is the people, and the king is only their representative. And this was a very revolutionary idea at the time. So revolutionary, it caused a revolution. So both the American Revolution and the French Revolution were pretty much directly caused by interactions with the Haudenosaunee. So we're talking about people whose ideas were extremely powerful, and perhaps because they had evolved these ideas very far away from the European milieu, and the Europeans were people who liked to bring ideas and combine them. So Marx and Engels were also very impressed by these ideas and wrote extensively about them. In fact, Marx's last book was all about notes he had taken about the Iroquois and other First Nations people, and Engels took those notes and turned them into a book that was directly influential on Lenin during the Russian Revolution. So finally, the two ladies whose names I wish I could remember, and it's killing me, I can't, Stanton and Gage. These are the ladies who first came up with feminism as a philosophy. And Gage in particular spent time living with the Haudenosaunee to understand how their system empowered women, because in the Haudenosaunee system, of course, women had not just direct control over the representation of the clans, but they controlled everything that happened within each village. The men had responsibility for everything outside of the village fields. But the division of labor was extremely egalitarian and involved a quality of life that was so superior to the European quality of life that one of the problems that the 13 American states faced originally was that the women kept on fleeing to live with the Haudenosaunee because of the two row wampum. Now, I don't know to what extent that applies numerically, because at this remove, we don't have everything. All we know is there was a lot written about it at the time. So in that tradition of taking these ideas and trying to make something of our own out of it, not trying to represent ourselves as the Haudenosaunee, not trying to appropriate their ideas, but inspired by their ideas, in XSCALE Alliance, we have been trying to adapt some of these ideas about clans, which we can think of as chapters, or at least analogous to chapters, and councils, and use them to be able to organize delivery of engineering work. I hesitate to use the phrase, but I will for a moment, at scale. So the Game Without Thrones is a Lego game that simulates an agile organization. It uses no command and control, no managers, no masters, no pre-made backlogs. Everybody who plays the game is driven by a set of metrics, and the metrics are divided up into chapters. So we have 6-person squads, and we'll talk about the chapter metrics in just a moment. The idea is that every member of each squad is in a different chapter, and each chapter will have a different metric. Now, I did go and do my Google searching for things that are out of copyright, but I'm not certain whether there really is license to use that one, so I'm going to move past it very quickly. Apparently, at least in America, there is a thing called fair use, but I don't want to rely on that too much. Anyway, for the purposes of teaching, it's supposed to be fair to be able to use such images. Well, here we have 6 chapters, and we've got a little symbol for each chapter. And the idea with this is that there are 6 people in each squad, each has a different chapter, which is to say each is concerned with a different metric. We have artists who care about the geometric and scale symmetry. Oh, I forgot to say what they're actually building. Well, this being Game Without Thrones, they really ought to be building something that doesn't look like a castle. But with Lego, the easiest thing to build is a castle. So the basic premise of the game is that these are all wildlings, and they're being blackmailed into building castles for the various feudal houses, because the feudal houses are so busy having wars with each other that they have no capability to build things for themselves. And there is just a tiny bit of evidence in the show for that. There's a scene where, for those who know the show, where Tywin is talking with Arya, and she's pretending to be a serving wench instead of the daughter of one of the other houses. And Arya teases Tywin, because he teases her about her accent, saying she's got a very cultured voice for someone who's a serving wench, and she explains she's the daughter of a stonemason, and stonemasons are very cultured. And he questions this, and she says, "Have you ever met a stonemason?" And it becomes very clear that he hasn't. So maybe it's not that far off. Anyway, in our game, that's the premise. It doesn't mean it has to work in the show or the books. So artists care about the geometric and scale symmetry of the castle being built. They focus breadth first, not losing sight of the whole. Architects care about having the biggest, grandest castle. So they want to enclose empty space, and they focus on reusable practices and tools. Merchants care about the number of rooms and the number of different rooms, because they have to sell the castle to the lords and ladies. And you might go, well, wait a second. This is agile. Why don't we have these lords and ladies represented? If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, I wouldn't particularly want to be in a sprint review with some of the lords and ladies. I don't think you'd last very long. But it comes back to us when we start to ask ourselves, wait a second, why do we have people who are privileged to represent the customer? If we have customer representatives, by all means, let's have a chapter of them. But if we have people who are product owners, and somehow they have this privilege that they know more about our customers than anybody else, well, that doesn't mean that they understand the design constraints. And it doesn't mean that they understand the technical constraints. So having, in lean UX terms, a product team of business stakeholders, design stakeholders, and technical stakeholders operating as peers, we would have something that would look a little bit like this. So we can think of the merchant as a product owner if it pleases someone. The Meister, this is the nearest thing that Game of Thrones has to scientist. And in this game, they care about the sturdiness of the Lego. The captain, well, this is kind of an optional role. But their metric is military preparedness. They worry about trebuchets and boiling oil and so on. But then we have a special role. We call this role the coach. And so if we were to rank each of, or if the people who are worrying about these metrics were to rank their score for their castle on a scale of 1 to 5, if the coach multiplied those numbers together, he would be able to make a bigger difference by going from a 1 to a 2 than a 2 to a 3. That's basically their concern, is balancing the other metrics. But they have a special power, and we'll come to that. We're going to have 4 ceremonies in the game Without Thrones, and since this is the kind of game you play at a meetup or as a training session, we're only going to have 5 minutes per. We have sprints where each squad builds castle features. We have chapter meetings where people meet in their chapters per value stream. We'll come to that too, to propose new castle features and treaties between the squads or between the value streams. And we'll look at that in a minute too. Stream refactoring. Well, we have these squads building their features independently, and they have to integrate this stuff to form a single castle for their value stream, and later to integrate those stream castles to form a portfolio castle. And then we have retros, where we're trying to improve workflow by all means, but since we only have 5 minutes, the key part of the retros here is ratifying and modifying the treaties that were proposed by the chapters. So let's have a look at what this looks like. I'll whiz past the next little bit. We talked about leadership as a service last time. This is the superpower of the coach. The idea is if a squad cannot make a decision, if they get polarized, then the coach will pick an individual role to make the decision for them. That's not part of the way that the Haudenosaunee did their business. Well, there are some places where people get to usurp a decision under certain circumstances. But here we don't have the idea of clan mothers. So we've got to find something that works as close as possible to offset that. And that idea of leadership as a service works so well at so many different levels, we're quite confident in applying it here. So in the show, there is a small council, and we've already talked about councils, but the key here is that this is a council of chapter representatives, or chapter leaders, then the leader of the coach chapter. And I should immediately emphasize these leaders are not permanent leaders. We are going to rotate them, and we'll look at what that looks like in just a moment. But the leader of the coach chapter will provide leadership as a service, that the decider pattern to the council as well. So I think I'll skip over this one too, but the basic idea is we will have 3 squads per stream and 3 streams per portfolio. So that's to say that the smallest version of this game we could play, if we only had 5-person squads, would be 15 people, and the largest would be about 108. The largest we've actually played was 54. That was April of last year. But we've run dozens of these, and they always work well. So we've run a bunch of experiments with them as well. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But now I think we know enough to understand what we're looking at in this animation. So does that make sense so far, Stefan?
To me, yes. Okay. I mean, I will give it a try next Thursday, right?
Oh, that's right. You are playing it next week.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about it? Are you confident?
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong with 30 people in the room, right? I mean,
that was the way I felt the first time I ran this. I was scared witless. Well, I had a bunch of my friends there to help, to try, who all understood. But what was really funny was they had nothing to do. Because in doing things this way, we're building a learning ecosystem, and it all becomes self-reinforcing. But rather than claim that, let me show it. Here we have 3 squads in the same stream, all doing their sprints together. By same stream, I mean they're working on the same castle, and they're going to build features for the same castle. Where do they get the definition of features from? Well, after the first 5 minutes of just working on the floor plan for the castle, they reorganize themselves into chapters. We already know what the metric and focus of each chapter is, so that's pretty straightforward. And this idea of having 3 squads, and just to say 3 people per chapter, we did a bunch of experiments where we tried chapters of 4, 5, and 2. And we found that 3 is the sweet spot. Now, exactly why it's the sweet spot, I think is an interesting thing for us to study. But my opinion, from having seen a few of these, I think what happens is that while one person in the chapter is explaining something to another person, the third person is thinking about what's the next thing that should happen in this conversation. And then those roles keep rotating around at a very rapid pace. You wind up with a much more vibrant communication going on. You can hear the buzz in the air and much faster flow of learnings. I don't have a metric for that in this game, but in my humble opinion. Anyway, I encourage everybody to try it with different numbers and see what seems to work best for them. But for me, particularly if we get all these chapters to be using a Kanban, each chapter has its own Kanban. If you're really interested in running this, we have a deck that has the Kanbans that we use in it. If they are all literally sitting on the same wall, then the cross-pollination of ideas between the chapters is quite an accelerator as well. Anyway, after their chapter meetings, they go back to their squads, or most of them do in the game. And what they're doing in the 4 people per squad, they are attempting to integrate the feature that they built into this central stream castle. Now, that's 12 people trying to do that integration all at the same time. 12 is not a very good number for a mob. It works, and every time we've done this, it works. But we're going to look at the end of this at something we call a hackathon without thrones, where we have a way of getting it to be just 6, and the other 6 people, we have a very important thing for them to do, which we'll come to. So while those 4 persons per squad are doing their integration of, well, at this stage, just the floor plan of the castle, the 6 people in the middle, that's our council. And they, in the 5 minutes, all they're doing is prioritizing the features that were proposed by the chapters. And since there is a representative of each chapter in that central castle, they didn't have to write any notes on what the feature meant. They were in all the conversations about the feature that happened in their chapter. So they understand that very well. The purpose of this council is to use leadership as a service, that the decider protocol, to use that to prioritize the features that have been proposed. And that's where we get our marching orders in this game. That's where we get our release plan from. Okay, so far, Stefan?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so now we can send everyone back to their retro. In that first 5 minutes, we didn't do any work with the treaties. So now we need the chapter representatives to go and get the treaties that were proposed by each chapter that was on the chapter Kanban, bring them back and try to work them out. Not just work them out together, but also to get their squads to either agree or disagree with them. A squad has to be unanimous in agreeing to a treaty, otherwise it's not bound by the treaty. And since this is not that many people, it's not that difficult to get that kind of alignment. If you want to see the normal form of a treaty, again, dig out the full Game Without Thrones deck, and we'll send out links to that. But you can, if you just search for it, you can find it as well. Google finds it. So now we get to go back and have our sprints again. Does this make sense so far?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, so that's almost everything there is to it, except for one really important thing. So now we have next chapter meetings. We want to form our next council, but we can't use the same people that we used last time. We want a different set of people involved in the council, because if we don't have everybody represented face to face, then we're not abiding by the Agile Manifesto. And more to the point, then the people who are in the castle start to become powerful, and their conversations start to disconnect from the conversations happening in the squads. They become managers. We don't want that. So this regular rotation gets rid of that problem. Now, how do we actually do the rotation? Well, you'll notice we have 2 chapters that begin with A, the artists and the architects. 2 that begin with C, the coaches and the captains, and 2 that begin with M, the merchants and the meisters. So as a facilitator, I simply say, well, I'd like the artist and the architect in the first council from squad 1, and the coach and the captain from squad 2, and the merchant and meister from squad 3. And then for the second council, I rotate the numbers. So I'd like artist and architect from squad 3, coach and captain from squad 1, merchant and meister from squad 2. So first one time was 1, 2, 3, then 3, 1, 2, and then the third one we do 2, 3, 1, and that way we get this rotation effect. So if we continue this way, aligning the treaties, doing the sprints, having the chapter meetings, taking the learnings in the form of proposed treaties and features, taking them into the council to prioritize after having done a rotation, and meanwhile integrating the features that have been built into the central council. And for a stream, we're able to get a very nice symmetrical outcome. However, what we would like to see is, how does this work with multiple streams? So here we have the stream councils from each stream. And at the end of the game, Without Thrones, we get their members together as chapters across the streams. Now, you might immediately go, wait a second, doing that just once, that doesn't seem very agile, and it isn't very agile. So when we get to Hackathon Without Thrones, which is the next step up from this, which we're going to be trialing in the next month or two, we have a solution to that, and we'll come to it, because we don't have an animation of it yet, but we do have a clear description of it. So hold that thought if you're wondering how that works. Now, the portfolio chapter meetings, they're sharing learnings across streams, and they're proposing integration treaties and features. In the Hackathon Without Thrones, they will be worrying about epics as well, but we're not going to worry about epics here. And I mean epics in the XSCALE normal form of why, who, how, what, and the pirate metrics, but let's not go into that here. So now we have formed a portfolio council out of our stream councils. And you might go, wait a second, what are the other stream councils? The 4 members can't do anything, and that's exactly right. They go back to their squads to continue with the activities there. This portfolio council, however, has all of the responsibility for integrating the stream castles, the castles per stream, into a portfolio castle. And we do this again in 5-minute segments interspersed with the other work that's going on, or actually in parallel with the other work that's going on, and it works very neatly. So those stream councils, everybody, both the portfolio council and the stream council, these are just the people who are doing the work. And you might go, wait a second, if we were doing this in a real organization, where do I plug in my HR people? Where do I plug in my compliance people, my financial people? Well, there's nothing that says these councils can't have externals sitting on them to inform their decisions. So it's actually a very neat way to combine people, depending on their level. Enterprise architects, for example, we might want to put into stream councils, and HR and CFO office people and compliance and legal and so on. We probably want them to work directly with the portfolio council. So we're not saying that you have to only have 6 persons on a council. However, it works very neatly when you do. And the whole point of this is to get an experience of it. Does that make sense enough for me to move on, Stefan, or do you have questions?
No, not at the moment. As usual, you need to try this hands-on and and then get down in the trenches, and then it'll all work out one way or another. Yes.
All right, then. Well, I'm going to do a hand wave about Hackathon Without Thrones, and we'll have animations for this next month. So, before we get into it, we have an idea which we talked about when we were talking about in the podcast about product management. We call this a 3D Kanban, where the idea is we apply the old XP principle of Yagni. You aren't going to need it. We apply that principle to the work breakdown structure. We don't break features out of epics until we need them to hit a particular release goal. We don't break stories out of features until we need them to be able to deliver the feature. And that minimizes the number of moving parts that we have to represent. So this 3D Kanban is effectively the same as a PI planning wall, but it localizes concerns so that we have a much easier time of embracing change. which after all is the point. If we're going to be an agile organization and we want to take on learning rapidly, we can't afford to be dealing with a vast network of pieces of red string and gigantic big room planning meetings. In what we've just seen, there was no big room planning. All of the concerns of the portfolio were dealt with by a small room. All the concerns of each value stream was dealt with in a small room. And that's basically the principle that we get from the Iroquois. The idea of clans and councils in a fractal pattern, we can apply that no matter what combination of chapters we have in our structure. And you might go, wait a second, does that mean we don't have guilds? It does not mean we don't have guilds. These are just practice patterns. This is not a prescription. It doesn't have to look like this. What we're trying to do with this is give you an illustration of those patterns, and you can take them into your own culture. But the whole intent with this is the same as any pattern. Yagni applies. You don't apply a practice pattern unless you're experiencing the problem or the risk that it solves. So that means you can be quite economical in applying this where you need it, and where you don't need it, don't apply it, for God's sake. So I'm not going to explain 3D Kanban in any more depth. We talked about it a little bit also in the Seven Samurai Kanban. So folk who have watched that and the product management podcast will have a pretty clear idea about this. So that brings us to the change in rules we need to get the phrase we often use for descaling in XSCALE is this idea of self-directing portfolios, of self-managing streams, of self-organizing teams. How do we do that with these arrangements? Well, if you go back and have a look at the rotations of representation in the councils, you'll see that we rotated by 2 every time. If we rotate by 1 click, not 2, then we wind up with 2 people in the council from each squad, or if we're talking about across the streams, then from each stream. And one of them was on the previous council, and one of them was not. So that means that now our councils have a memory, and that's very valuable. It means that people understand why decisions were made. We don't have a new council made entirely of new people, but people are still going to rotate out. Now, you might go, wait a second, what happens when they rotate out? Do you remember I was saying that 12 people is not a very good number of people to be doing a mob refactoring exercise? I think that Wood Israel would not be crazy about the idea. Well, this way, we can rotate people into one extra function. That extra function is oh, did I write it wrong? I think I did write it wrong. Here where it says, oh no, I did write it right. Never mind, sorry, don't mind me, I'm being silly. Okay, so the extra function is those chapters across the streams per portfolio. So if that goes on at the same time as the refactoring, effectively what happens is that people rotate into those portfolio chapters, 2 people per squad, and then that gives them a 1 in 3 chance of representing their stream in the portfolio council that comes up after. So the neat thing about this is, well, what happens if someone, if we were doing this in 5-minute chunks, well, someone might need to visit they might have a call of nature. Oh, well, that's okay. We've still got the people who are doing the refactoring. We could substitute one of those in temporarily. So there's some slack built into this, and there's other ways to build slack into it. So that just in case we have an understudy, a second, somebody who was in those chapters, but who isn't, if they're not available, who isn't critical to making the council work, we still have an ability to make the council work. So this arrangement enables us to have the portfolio council and the stream councils happening, well, every week if we like. We probably wouldn't have only 5 minutes per sprint, but the amount of time we dedicate to each of these ceremonies, it depends on what's convenient to us. So the lovely thing about this is that this gives us a way to adapt these patterns to the culture we're working in and to the cadences we want to work to. But in principle, all of this work can happen to daily and weekly cadences. We certainly don't need to wait 3 months before adapting to the learnings that we've got per squad. And in general, the advantage here is that those learnings flow extremely rapidly across the squads via the chapters and across the streams via the cross-stream chapters, which means that the left hand and the right hand know what they're doing. So I think that's a stopping point, Stefan, but perhaps we can take some questions.
Yeah, I think so too. So first question from my side, what do we do with all these people in the middle that are well paid and that provide a sort of proof of usefulness to the organization by showing up in meetings and leaving traces in SharePoint?
Yes. Well, we actually have a way of dealing with them. Let me do a share screen and show you a brief diagram of it, but I'll talk about it while that's coming up. So these ideas work very nicely with all of the middle management and safe roles. So the beautiful thing about what we're doing is that when we combine them, it doesn't look very different to what SAFe or LESS or DAD or Lean Kanban, what all of the scaling frameworks already look like. Let me see if I can find the picture I'm looking for. Somewhere in here, I've got it. Yes, that's the picture I'm looking for. Here we go, that'll do us. So if we think of the vertical stripes on the left as value streams and the horizontal things that look like piano keys as chapters, and if we understand that the feature squad chapters only exist per stream, not across all of the feature squads in the portfolio, which should all be clear from the animation we just looked at, I hope. If we understand that, then we can use leadership as a service with people who already have titles like product manager and system manager and portfolio manager or program manager. All of these fold in very nicely. Now, do we actually need those people? Well, that's a matter for the portfolio council or portfolio squad, depending on how you want to name these things, to decide. So the neat thing with doing things this way is we can still include all of the practice patterns from one or another framework. Here we're showing a combination with the guild structures from Spotify. But this is not a prescription. What we're looking at here is not the XSCALE way of doing things. This is simply applying XSCALE patterns in combination with SAFe patterns. So we can keep all of those people. We don't need to disenfranchise them. Leadership as a service gives us a way of making use of them. And then later on, the portfolio council might decide, you know, actually, we'd really like people who work this way to be doing something functional, not just to be people we delegate decisions to when we need leadership. We would like to have a way of empowering people as directly responsible individuals, which is one of the XBA patterns we borrow from Steve Jobs' Apple and Next arrangements. So I don't know if that answered you, Stefan.
It does.
Cool. Okay. Any other questions?
Oh, any other questions? Yes.
What have we got?
So no questions coming in. Let's call this a webinar, I would say.
I think that's a good stopping point. We've gone pretty long on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
No worries, mate. All right, Stefan. Well, actually, there's one thing we should probably mention. Next time, I like the idea we give a little teaser. Next time, I think we're going to talk about throughput accounting.
That would be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And the one after that, I'd like to give you enough time to prep for it, because I know you're going to be very busy getting your first Game Without Thrones happening. Where is it? Just by the way, we should plug it.
It will take place here in Berlin at one of the largest startups. They volunteer to provide the space and the folks. And so at the moment, we have about 50 people who pretend they want to come, and about
Ooh, that's very
27 or so
exciting.
on the waiting list. Yeah, but it's summer in Berlin, and if the weather is good, they probably won't show up. A lot of competition for attention. We
Well,
manage, but if we
yeah,
can staff one stream, it'll be a good start. And
it
we have
would be.
scheduled another one for October. We already have the space, everything, so we can iterate on the learnings.
Very cool. I think we've run enough of these on all of the continents that we're present on at the moment to feel some sense of control, but at the same time, there's a first time for everything. I will do my damnedest to be available to you in any way that you need. But now let's get back to wrapping this thing up. So by all means, if you can, please do make it along to Stefan's first one of these in Berlin, at least to provide moral support, if for no other reason. I think you'd learn a lot there. And next time, is that going to be 2 weeks from now?
That will be in 2 weeks from now, yes.
Okay. And the time after that, let's do your one. What, I don't know what you want to call it. The one about scaling in nature.
Yeah, let's think about this. I haven't yet
All right.
finished the book completely. We'll see to pencil it in and then take it from there. Yeah.
We might be able to borrow some things from the Agile DAO in the same one. Anyway, that's for later on. So 2 weeks, throughput accounting. All good.
Awesome.
All right, mate.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
For your time,
Stefan.
Pete. Have a great week.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.